What I want to talk about today, the formative directions of Zionism. Most people don't know about the things that I hope to cover, and even historians who have written about the rising of Zionism at the end of the 19th century have managed to miss quite a lot of important parts. I've given you a short reading list, which I think is full of excellent books, and both Ilan Pape and Nur Masalha have filled the gap that I'm talking about and covered the very early part of Zionism. So I am not starting, as people normally do, with Herzl in 1896 or 1893. I'll come to that, but I'm not starting with that. I'm actually starting with Christian Zionism in the 19th century, because Zionism was not a Jewish invention, it was a Christian invention. Indeed, it was an English Christian invention, and therefore we have a double interest in that invention. So, people know that Britain is responsible for the Palestine problem, especially people sitting in this room, and people are thinking back to Balfour and to the Mandate and to, Britain putting down the Arab revolt, etc. Or those of us who remember a bit of the early history of the 20th century might go back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is now spoken about quite a lot because of the war in Syria and the situation in Iraq. But this is actually taking us back to 1915, and I want to talk about the beginning of the 19th century. Now, Napoleon actually invents the problem. Hello. Hi. Napoleon has a bright idea. Napoleon was a modernist, and in 1799 he decides that he will cut the route to India through Arabia and control it by taking Egypt. And you know what happened. He fails, or let's put it more accurately, he succeeds amazingly taking over Egypt with one small battle, but immediately afterwards the British Navy defeats Napoleon in 1799, the Battle of Alexandria, and Napoleon runs away, and where to, if not Palestine? He takes most of Palestine within a few months. So in a sense, the West is moving into the Middle East, and especially into Palestine, as early as the last year of the 18th century. And this is where I think Zionism really comes from. If this is the title of the talk, where it comes from. It comes from European Christian liberals, which Napoleon was one at one point in time, of course, and he did quite a lot to free Jews of the kind of stringent limitations that were in vogue in most European countries before his reign. And in a sense, a lot of the liberal legislation which is passed after Napoleonic victories frees the Jews for the first time in Europe from the strictures that were imposed on them. So he combined the fact that he was liberal in that way with endless imperial energy. Not colonial at that point, because he wasn't trying to colonize Palestine, he wasn't trying to colonize Egypt, he wanted to control them. He failed in both of those tasks, but he manages to do something else. He manages to awaken an interest in Britain that was quite dormant up to that point. Well, the British were very rocked by the Napoleonic success of taking Egypt overnight. This was a terrible thing for the British Empire, they thought. And they thought, actually, it has a point to control Egypt. And of course, you remember the Suez Canal will only come 60 years later. So this is still pre the Suez Canal. But Egypt was very important on the way to India. So, of course, Napoleon had a plan not just to control Egypt, but actually to control the western part of India. But he never got that far, of course. So this was kind of tit for tat between the British and the French at the end of, following the revolution. Of course, the revolution rocked the British upper class very much. And they were totally rattled about the possibility of Napoleon also taking Britain. And that was a real possibility, of course. So anything they could do to clip his wings would be a good thing. And so Nelson moves to Egypt, defeats Napoleon, and Napoleon ends up in Palestine, which he actually takes almost lock, stock and barrel, apart from Acre. The Battle of Acre was more difficult and he failed in that, but he took Jerusalem. And of course, when he came to Egypt, he presented himself as a Muslim. There were leaflets in Arabic that actually presented him as a Muslim who was converted to Islam because he's so impressed by this religion and he's come to help the Muslims in Egypt. And he didn't quite say when he took Jerusalem that he has become Jewish, but his name as a liberal and as a possible liberator of Jews was before him. So this was quite an interesting thing about Napoleon. Now the British, of course, got rattled, not just because of Egypt, but especially because of Palestine. And I don't have a lot of time to speak about that, but you could actually have the whole evening on this formative period. And what happens is that the British upper class, especially the Tory party, figures like the Israeli, for example, who comes from a Jewish background, he is indeed baptized, but he comes from a Jewish background, and quite a few other people start writing about Palestine in what we would now consider as a Zionist outlook. A number of novels, both by Israeli and other people, have been written with a biblical setting in the periods of 1825 until 1845, yeah? All in English, all by the people from the English upper classes, and they are presenting a kind of, an ideal situation which is based on a number of British interests. Britain as an empire wants to control Palestine because Palestine is the connecting tissue of Asia, Africa and Europe. It's this location which has made it impossible to ignore for any empire that was in the area. Yeah? So look at every empire that has moved into either the Middle East or the Arab East, and they had to control Palestine, because to move from Asia to Africa, you had to move through Palestine. So the British upper class is quite decided that Palestine is very important for the British Empire, but they don't know how to do it. It's not a simple thing. Palestine is part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is a corpse that keeps dying and yet breeding. And you know, when historians today look at the Ottoman Empire, they don't see it as the sick man of Europe, which it was described as the time, but they see it as probably the most liberal empire that controlled the Middle East ever, the British Empire included. So in hindsight, the Turkish Ottoman Empire was a live and let live empire. It did not destroy huge parts of the Middle East like every other empire before or since, including the British Empire. And in a sense, because it was so inefficient in its operations, it didn't cause much damage also. But for the British to wrench Palestine and Egypt out of the clutches of the Turkish Ottomans is not a simple task. And they start working on it. Now, I want to just, in a couple of sentences, to say something about archaeology. Archaeology as a science is an invention of Napoleon. In 1799, he was the first emperor. He wasn't called it, but he was an emperor already. He was the first emperor that understood the importance of science for empire. And he took with him 360 scientists, historians, art historians, artists, draftsmen, painters, architects, you name it, he had them. 360 scientists and artists in order to present to the world the definitive record of Egypt. This record took 26 years to come about. Napoleon was dead when the last part of this huge encyclopedia actually was published in France. Each of the volume is about this high. They're very heavy, and there are 29 of them. And they are really beautiful. And if you can ever look at them at the British Library or at the French National Library, they are amazing. There are not many copies left. There are something like 30 copies in the world, but there were many at the time. And it includes every aspect of Egypt you can think of. Flora, fauna, geography, a bit of early sociology about the religions of Egypt, about the history of Egypt. It's all beautifully illustrated, no expense was spared, and this is probably the only serious contribution of any empire to science that I know about. And so I'm mentioning this because Napoleon understood that what we now call archaeology, at the time it wasn't called that because it didn't exist as a science, as this discipline yet, is very important for making claims, political claims, over territory. And so, in order to make a claim over Egypt, which didn't work, of course, he thought that he had to have the kind of evidence which the Description d'Egypte, this whole encyclopedia was called Description de l'Egypte, would give him a political support. However, the British didn't like Napoleon, but they really liked that idea of the empire using science, art, literature, and archaeology in order to control the Middle East. And actually, an archaeological war starts between France and Britain that lasted more or less 120 years. So there's no time to go into that, but it's a really fascinating topic which you can read. I didn't put it in the reading list, but you can read quite a lot about, and I suggest it's very interesting. Now, why do I mention this? Because two societies set up in London early in the 19th century are very important for Zionism. One of them is called, where am I? The Palestine Exploration Fund. The PEF is set up in the 1860s, and it is set up after a lot of British politicians and intellectuals, writers, authors, artists have actually visited Egypt and Palestine on what was then called the Grand Tour. And you would know about Byron and Shelley and people like that because they've written about it. But actually quite a lot of the upper class in England ended up in the Middle East on the Grand Tour. And a lot of them have written about their tour. And that popularized Palestine yet again. Now this was part of a very important revivalism of Christianity and Protestant Christianity specifically in Britain, that is starting, of course, in the 16th century, but is continuing and actually picking up because of Napoleon, ironically, because of Napoleon, and because he kind of reignited the interest. There comes a political time and a cultural time where Palestine and Egypt are very important for the British upper class. Why? Because this Christianity needed to be grounded in some kind of fact. Because we're talking about the 19th century, it's not enough to tell people that Jesus died on the cross. You have to actually supply some kind of scientific evidence that the Bible is a historical document rather than just, if you want, a piece of literature like the Odyssey or the Iliad. And they actually took the Bible to be that, to be an accurate historical document, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And therefore, what's better than going to Palestine, going to Egypt, which are the birthplaces of both Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and finding the evidence for Jesus, you know, if you find, you know, parts of the cross, of course, we know about that story and the building of the church in Jerusalem, finding nails, finding all kind of evidence for Jesus' life. And of course, going back to Abraham, finding supposedly locations where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph spent their childhood and so on. And of course, finding evidence for the most important thing, for the exodus from Egypt. So Palestine and Egypt are one continuum in this historical exercise. Now the Grand Tour becomes an archaeological tour. It's not just going to places, to the pyramids, to Jerusalem, to the Christian locations in Palestine and in Egypt and Mount Sinai, etc. But actually, they are, in a sense, spurred on by the great exhibition of the Napoleonic exercise of science in the service of empire. They're now doing the British version of that. So the Palestine Exploration Fund is only the latest of many such spurts of energy, scientific energy, that crystallize. Now, if you look at the publications of the Palestine Exploration Fund from any period, but especially from the 60s, 70s, and 80s of the 19th century, you will see in front of each of the publications, there is the list of the trustees of the organization. And every one of those trustees is a high-ranking officer of the British Imperial Army. Yeah? Every one of them is a colonel, a general, etc. We're not talking about lieutenants here. And some of them not just colonels, but also very high up in the Church of England, which was possible then. Today we would think this is really strange, but then it was possible. So a lot of those people are of course related to the Church of England, but all of them are related to the Imperial Army. And the Imperial Army is actually planning on the taking of Palestine. Of course, they are sitting in Egypt for most of this period in a kind of capacity of peacekeeper, supposedly, but basically the controller of Egypt. And the Turks sort of accept that because, after all, Nelson has saved Egypt from the French, yeah? So there is a kind of uneasy acceptance of British influence in Egypt, but no British influence in Palestine yet. Now, by the late 30s, the 1830s, Britain establishes a consulate in Jerusalem. And the first consul is, I put his 2 books, he's written many more, and so did his wife. After his death, and one book before his death, she wrote 3 books about the period in Jerusalem. The consul Finn and his wife are really important for the development of Zionism. Why? Because you can see what Britain was trying to do. It was the attack on Palestine was 3-pronged. It was the army officers that were also in the Church of England, and also were amateur archaeologists. At some point in time, the word archaeology is introduced, and they are then professionals. Up to that point, they were dabbling in something that didn't even have a name, but was very exciting. Yeah, we know archaeology is very exciting. And the task is to find the evidence for the veracity of the Bible. And if the veracity of the Bible could be proven, then the task for them, in order to bring forward the second coming, is of course follow the events list in the book of Revelations and in other texts in the New Testament, and to bring about those events so that the world will be saved again. There will be the second coming. Now, we might think today that this was a bit odd for army generals to deal with and to actually uphold, but they didn't think so. And what then happens is, of course, in order for the second coming to come about, the Jews have to go back to Palestine. This is part of the deal. Now, you will know, I'm sure that people in this audience would be totally aware of the fact that there is a huge following which is Christian for Zionism in the United States, because they still hold that kind of belief, and that project is not abandoned. They are now approaching it with vigor over the last few decades, and may God help us if they are ever successful in any way. Yeah? I don't believe in God, but for this purpose I would believe in God, Now, what then happens is that a cultural, political, scientific revolution takes place in in England. I say in England, it's also Scotland, of course, and to a degree Wales. So we should talk about Britain rather than England. Of course, England is the dominant partner. But the church is pushing from its corner. The army is pushing for control of Palestine and Egypt and the rest of the Middle East. And of course, the politicians are involved, and many of those politicians are also very important writers. So you can see that we're not talking about the little scientific community here of archaeologists. Archaeology is the tool for getting into the area. That is if you want, an excuse to be there to map Palestine, because you can't actually have a military campaign without mapping, and I'll come to that later on in a few minutes. And basically what happens is one expedition after another is sent to both Palestine and Egypt in order to do the preparation for the full control, or fuller control, of those territories under the British Empire. I can't really go on because I need to get to other things. But, well, just a sec. Just to say that the story of archaeology in Palestine is really fascinating. I'm sure you are aware. And I want to just mention one example that I'm sure most people probably wouldn't have heard about. The British wanted, for 50 years before the First World War, to have a proper map of Palestine. Now, of course, because of hot air balloons, it was possible now to use other tools that were not available before for the cartographer to map large areas from the air. Of course, then photography is added, so you can take photographs from the air of large areas, and that improved enormously the accuracy of cartography. So the British are trying very hard through masquerading the project as a kind of archaeological project to have a survey of the whole of Palestine. They've done Egypt because they are in Egypt. The Turks do not allow them because the Turks are not stupid, and they realize what the British are planning, and they don't allow them this. Now, I won't talk about all the kind of ins and outs of it, just on how the first map of Palestine was completed by the British. For years, the PEF, the Palestine Exploration Fund, was a tool of Christian Zionism. And they did quite a lot of work. And if you look at the early archaeologists, all of them are officers of the British Army. Some in the Navy, but they're all British officers. And at some point in time, when it became quite clear that there will be a war in 1914, the British are really pulling all the stops to get that map done. And they persuade the PEF, the Palestine Exploration Fund, which is a scientific organization, nothing to do with politics, of course. It just happens to have half of the British ruling class on its, you know, just by chance. They're interested in science. So they persuaded the PEF to launch a campaign of surveying Sinai and the southern part of Palestine in order to find evidence for the Exodus, you know, the movement through Sinai to Palestine. Of course, we today know there was no Exodus, it's a myth. You know, even Zionist historians had to admit that, not most of them, but some. But the Exodus in the 19th century is still a very strong myth, and you remember in the 20th century a film by that name and how successful that was. So this is a very powerful myth that is helping Zionism quite a lot. And they persuade the Turks that this is a scientific operation and look very hard at someone that will run it so that it will be done properly. A young army officer by the name of T.E. Lawrence is chosen for this project. You would know that this is Lawrence of Arabia, so-called, but this is before he's Lawrence of Arabia. He is actually, at that point in time, as an army officer, doing some digging in what would become Iraq. Yeah? And he's been there for 2 years, and he's getting on quite well, knows the Middle East, knows quite a lot about Arabia, likes the Arabs, you know. So he's a good guy to put as a commander of this. And Lawrence is invited to come immediately. He's given a week, which in those days was quite fast, to come to Palestine. And Lawrence, to the last of his days, claimed that he didn't know that this was about mapping. But you know, if you believe that, you'll believe anything. So Lawrence is handed the project, and he and one other archaeologist are actually doing the survey of Sinai and southern Palestine. And with them, there are 12 army surveyors that are doing the real job of mapping Palestine. The map is still in the PEF. They mapped it throughout the beginning of 1914. There was no time, you know, they had to work hard and fast, and they did it in 6 weeks. Now, if you talk to cartographers today, they will say to you that's not possible. They couldn't use airplanes. Of course, airplanes existed. They couldn't use airplanes because the Turks would work out what they're doing. So they had to use only camels. And camel riding, they actually in 6 weeks did the most accurate map of Palestine to this day until mapping from the air started. This map is incredible, and this was a great secret. They went back to Britain with the map. It was printed in few thousand copies a few weeks before the war, and General Allenby used it in order to take southern Palestine in 1916 and 1917. So it serves its purpose. And why am I telling you this story apart from the fact that it's so amazing? Because this is just an example of how archaeology and science and culture were used by the British Empire to further quite nefarious designs. Now, you might think this was not nefarious. I do believe it was. And basically, there was, of course, something else that was happening in 1916 and 1917, and that is the Balfour Declaration, which you'll discuss next week. I'm not going to talk about that. But, of course, the British hoi polloi are actually preparing to take Palestine well before Weizmann starts badgering them about the Balfour Declaration. Not for Zionism, but also for Zionism. Now, I want to talk about the Finns and close this, because I think I outlined an area of interest, and then you can follow it up yourself. The Finns are really amazing. They were very firm believers, Christian believers, and also belonged to another society, which was the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews. Now, of course, if you want to bring the second coming about, you have to promote Christianity amongst the Jews, because that's in the Bible. It'll have to happen. It has to take place. So this is a society set up a short while after the Napoleonic adventures, and basically to take the Jews into the Church of England rather than to lose them to Catholicism. Yeah? There was already a battle in Palestine between Catholic churches, between Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and the Church of England, and few others, as you know, who will convert the Jews, and of course it was a big prize to win the conversion of the Jews was a big prize. So he was quite central in this society, but he was more interesting than the kind of run-of-the-mill people that were in that society. Why? Because first of all, he was a liberal person, and in Palestine he realized something that never occurred to him before when he became consul. He lived in Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, the biggest group of population were the Jews. There were not many Jews in Palestine, of course, but most of them, the biggest group, lived in Jerusalem for many generations. And he realized that they are the poorest part of the population. Now, he wasn't exactly a socialist, but he actually was, if you want, a typical Christian with a social conscience. Many of the people in the Labour Party later on will come from exactly that background. So we know that. And he thought that he must do something for those Jews while he's waiting for them to convert, so to speak. Yeah, okay, conversion will happen. He wasn't that worried about that by that time. But he needs to do something for those miserable souls because their life is really awful. Yeah? And he starts a charity which collects money in Britain and later in America, and collects quite a lot of money under the kind of project of converting the Jews. Actually, the money goes to less immediate. To more immediate needs of the community. So first of all, he realizes that the Jews in Jerusalem and in Safed and in Tiberias, the three centers of Jewish population in Palestine, are not working. Hardly any of them work. About 25% of them are artisans. But even the artisans don't work because they haven't got any work, because the Christians refuse to order anything from a Jew. The Muslims would sometimes, depending, but the Christians forget it. So basically, as a big group in Jerusalem, most of those people are unemployed. And they live on what is called the Chalukah, which is money coming from the diaspora to support the Jewish population of Palestine. This is collected for many, many centuries. And then in Palestine there is, you can imagine, a battle about who gets what of the loot from the diaspora. And this is very ugly, see? He dislikes it. And he thinks that he would do a good job in educating the Jews into productivity. And he does. And not only that, he thinks that it'll be a good idea to actually educate them into farming. Now, of course, Jews did not do any farming for the 1800 years at least. For many reasons, but in Palestine, where they could do farming, they didn't do it either. And he thinks that the best thing he could do is actually purchase some land and get those Jews to actually work on the land. And he does that on the road to Al Khalil, to what is called Hebron, is a place called Karam Al Khalil, in Hebrew Kerem Avraham, or the vineyard of Abraham. And he buys this piece of land, which was quite not that great for farming actually. And he fights the rabbinate in the central rabbinate in Jerusalem to allow the Jerusalem men and women who have nothing to eat and no work to actually be allowed at his expense to work the land, to till the land and produce some food for themselves. And I have to say, he is a very impressive character. If you read his book and his wife's book, they are very impressive people. And this is a social project, not anymore the Christian project he came with, in his package when he left England. But this has become a social project of resuscitating a community which is really moribund. And he's successful. He fights the rabbis don't agree, but the Jews are so hungry that they defy the rabbis and join the project, about 150 of them immediately, and later on up to 500. So it's not a majority of Jews in Jerusalem, but this is an interesting project. It's the first time that the Zionist project, which is totally Christian, is actually attracting Jews to farm the land in their Palestine at the cost of the C of E. And this is becoming more expensive, and the Jews demand higher salaries than the Arabs working the land. And there lies a tale which I have no time for. So I want to kind of like leave it there, yeah, because I've got to finish pretty soon. So most people don't know this history, that the first Jewish settlement outside of those three places on the land, a farming settlement, was actually a Christian project of the British Empire. Now, when I say the British Empire is the British consul, I don't think the British Empire as such actually planned it. But you know, these things happen in mysterious ways. And actually, he writes about it, and though it wasn't a British Empire project, the British Empire starts looking at this and saying, hey, he's got something, this guy. This is an interesting idea. What if we could get those Jews to come to Palestine, and they could be much closer to us than any of the other groups in the area because they are Europeans. So if we could get Jews from Europe to come there and to live on the land and so on, we have an agency in the area that we haven't at the moment got. Now, I draw a line here, and I want to go to Jewish Zionism. Now, of course, Jewish Zionism has a different start point and different reasoning and different pattern altogether. It starts mainly in 1881 after a series of very murderous pogroms in Russia. The Jews in Russia live in a very limited area. They're not allowed to leave it. It's called a Pale of Settlement. And in that area, they have very few occupations they are allowed to undertake. For example, pub owners, you know, people who deal with money, peddlers. They are not allowed to work the land, you know, the usual thing, you know those things. And of course, the Tsarist regime is coming under enormous pressure in the 70s and 80s because there is the Narodnik movement, there are social movements all over Russia. The serfs, in the end, do get freed, but then when they get freed, they have no livelihood whatsoever. So the whole of Russia is a huge bomb waiting to explode socially, and of course we know it did. And those explosions are periodic, and the 80s are full of proto-socialist action against the Tsar. Bombs, etc. You know the history. And of course, the Tsar and his minister Plehve, the interior minister, the anti-Semitic interior minister, find it the best solution to actually put down those peasant revolts and so on is to have pogroms. We know today that this is what the ruling class in this country is doing as we speak. They would like to have, well, maybe not pogroms, but, you know, let's start with buses going through London saying, go home, you know. And, you know, the racists will understand, what we're talking about. And they will already take it up upon themselves, which they do. The Russians, of course, didn't send buses. They actually sent the police to do the pogroms. And hundreds of Jews died in a week to begin with, and then more. And this was the worst incidence of anti-Semitism in the 19th century. And as a result, it became quite clear that with the Tsar in place, the Jews have no real future in Russia. And a number of hundreds to begin with, and later on it was as big as 5,000, actually go mainly by foot all the way to Palestine. They are called the lovers of Zion. and those lovers of Zion are setting up agricultural settlements in Palestine. This is East Europe. In the western part of Europe, Jews have won almost all the rights that they will have later on, including in England. And no Jew in his right mind is considering leaving Vienna, Paris, London, or Amsterdam and immigrating to Palestine. So they read about those few thousand Jews now living in very few agricultural settlements, which are basically a colon, a colon but without a base. They are called colonies. They didn't consider another system of negotiating the locals. They immediately went into colonialism. But at the moment, those colons are supported by Jewish millionaires like the Rothschild, Hirsch, and so on. And it's not a big deal. It's 3 agricultural settlements to begin with, and in the end 5. So we're not talking about a lot. I also want to mention 1905 because those same tensions are actually, yes, in the 80s, socialism has not been successful in Russia. But in 1905, it came close to toppling the Tsar, as you know. And the failed revolution of 1905 brings another round of anti-Semitism. And this time, few tens of thousands go to Palestine. And they will be the people, they are almost, without exception, left-wing and socialists. And they are, of course, in the leadership of local groups in Russia. And therefore, because Jews typically and understandably were in those groups, wishing rights for everyone, meaning rights for them as well, yeah? So if we want to have rights, we have to have rights for everyone. Then they were, of course, hounded, and they would be the ones building the kibbutz movement. So I want to start concluding. There are these 2 directions which create agricultural settlements, which I mentioned. Christian Zionism, about 60 years, 50 years before, it starts as a movement, but then in the late 40s and early 50s of the 19th century, there are actually Jews living on the land, and they're not doing very much, by the way, but the principle has been established, a model has been built, a theory has been expounded, and this can be, the British understand this is something to take note of. Herzl, who is obviously the originator of political Zionism, I don't want to go into talking about Herzl because that will take too much, and you probably know about it. He writes his pamphlet in total innocence. He didn't know very much about the Jewish settlements in Palestine. He was a very famous journalist in Vienna, but actually did not read the proto-Zionist texts that were published. And actually, a lot of them were saying exactly the same things that he said in 1896, earlier, about 10 years earlier. But he didn't read them. And he didn't understand the complexity of Palestine because he knew nothing about Palestine. He didn't, for example, know that Palestine is full of people. He actually believed for a long time that Palestine is a desert. Now, of course, he comes to know that quite quickly, but to begin with, he doesn't realize that. But he's moved by, supposedly, by the events in France at the beginning of the 90s, that is the Dreyfusard the Dreyfus events, yeah, the Dreyfus affair. I think he is more moved by the fact that the mayor of Vienna is a proto-Nazi, a racist, a self-confessed proud racist, who actually instigate anti-Semitism as official. So this is, I think, more important than what he has learned in Paris. And what he then works out is that, to begin with, what his amazing plan is this. He will persuade all the Jews to convert to Catholicism. This will be done in the Cathedral of Vienna. He will lead all the Jews to the cathedral to convert, but he himself will not convert. He will be the last Jew. He was a romantic, you know, you can see. His friends, and especially the chief rabbi of Vienna, says to him, either you are mad or you're naive. If you think this is a plan, and Herzl was indeed mad and naive. Not to say that he wasn't quite an exciting and interesting intellectual, yeah? But when it came to Zionism, he was mad and naive. And the chief rabbi of Vienna says to him, this is not a plan, just forget about it, don't tell anyone about it. Unfortunately, too many people already knew about it. And then Herzl comes with another plan, which of course is what Zionism is today. I know.
Just so that people
yeah.
can ask questions.
Yeah. Now, the plan is very interesting. The Jews would get Palestine from the Turkish Empire. How? He doesn't know. A, they will buy it. Nobody is selling. B, they would get another empire to get it for them. Well, nobody is queuing up yet. Then there was the plan that it will be infiltrated in greater and greater numbers, which is what has happened. Herzl is against it. He wants a proper mass immigration. He doesn't want he didn't want to do it by, you know, fly by night. That wasn't his idea. He was a grand intellectual, and he wanted grand plans. So his book describes how the Jews of Europe will uproot lock, stock and barrel, take everything, go to Palestine and build a new amazing society in the Middle East. And you know, this was quite influential, of course, in Jewish circles. But what is really interesting is to read his diary, where he writes the things that are not in the book. And in his diary, he says, of course, now that I know that Palestine is full of Arabs, we have to get rid of them. Read his diaries on the 12th of June, 1896, and you will be amazed. I think he was on some kind of substance. No, I mean, you know, it was normal then, you know, even Freud was, you know, so he was, I think, on cocaine. And he was writing about 100 pages on that day. And it's each of the entries is about 3 or 4 lines long. It's in bursts of energy. An idea about this, an idea about that. And he writes on the 12th of June 1896 that basically what we'll need to do is to take all the Arabs, pay them a few shekels and send them to what he calls the transfer countries, which are the countries surrounding Palestine. Arabs, you know, he is a Jew, and therefore he also is aware of anti-Semitism and actually agrees with it. Herzl was an anti-Semite, he says so himself, yeah? And he actually thinks like an anti-Semite. That is, you know, the peasants are not, you know, you pay them, they go. They're not tied to the land, there'll be no problem. You just pay them a little and they go. So this is called the transfer plan, which he dreams up. And he then that evening he realizes that there are some things he hadn't resolved. For example, Palestine, he heard, is full of snakes. Well, what to do, what to do? Well, every Palestinian, or not Palestinian, Arab, of course, he talks about, will get 5 francs for every snake. So before they go, he says, before they go, they will have to clean the country of snakes, then we can get rid of them. Now, of course, when Herzl is translated into English and into other languages, and including the German edition, and of course Hebrew, those parts of the diaries are censored. There's only one version which is uncensored. There are only 2 copies of it in Britain. I've actually put it on the reading list and try and get it at SOAS or British Library, and then you'll see all those things that were censored by all the other editions. So I want then to come to what I call, I've got to finish, the principles of Zionism. First of all, anti-Semitism is good, because it will get the Jews to move. And of course, anti-Semitism is today also understood as a good thing. Because how will we get the Jews of the United States to come to Palestine? You know, without anti-Semitism, they would not leave. Well, the Jews of Europe didn't leave without anti-Semitism. Herzl didn't go to Palestine. None of his people around him went to Palestine. Actually, the only Zionist that went to live in Palestine was, an English upper-class intellectual that, took this seriously, and he was a Christian. So these people wouldn't go without anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not an enemy. Anti-Semitism is something useful for us to, and we should not fight anti-Semitism. Yeah? Now, a lot of the Zionists still think like that, especially the ones in Israel. And this is very worrying, because not only would they not fight anti-Semitism, but they, of course, would not fight racism in the society, like in Britain. The racism today is against Muslims in Britain. Is that not something that Jews should actually feel very strongly about after their history? No, it isn't, because it's nothing to do with them. What would Israel do without the United States? Please tell me. What do they do? And now, of course, they're quoting China. Well, we know why. So they change empires. Yeah, they move from empire to empire, like Herzl moved from emperor to emperor. And when the empire becomes less useful, then they move to the next empire. This is a halo principle. Aliyah, I don't need to talk about. Military, Herzl establishes this principle. If we need to move, hundreds of thousands of people, more than 1 million people, in the end, 750,000 were, expelled forcibly. You need the military. And how do you get imperial support? You offer services to the empire. You persuade the empire of the day that only you, the Zionist movement, can give them the service that they require in the Middle East. And you know what? This is still the principle. The principle of divide and rule, the principle of you can rely on us because you can't rely on the bloody Muslims, on the bloody Arabs, the bloody Palestinians. All these people are not to be trusted. We are basically Europeans. Of course, they want to be in Europe. They detest the Middle East in a sense. They want to be in America, of course, but that's too far. So that principle is still there. So I want to finish by talking very briefly about what I call the 3 failures of Zionism, which people will probably say are the 3 successes of Zionism, because they only look at the short term. Now, Zionism is amazingly successful. There's no doubt about it. At the point that it is introduced, the colonial projects are finished. The big empires are losing their colonies. Britain is still there, of course, as an empire, but it's on the way out. And everyone that looks at what is happening understands that. So there is what I call an analytical failure. There's a failure to transcend the existing structures in Herzl and in those following him. And they go back rather than forward. They go back to the 19th century and choose the model of colonialism, aggressive colonialism with military support, with gunboats, with imperial support, instead of trying to think creatively. This is not possible. The second one is the practical failure. Okay, the analytical failure has happened. You know, Zionism did not propose anything apart from a military takeover of the land and an expulsion of the population of Palestine. But now that they are in Palestine, and supposedly they are socialists and left-wing and liberal and Democrats and the rest of it, and peace now and God not, you know, now that they live with Palestinians and these are human beings and they are next door to them, are they going to do all those things? Yes, they are doing all those things that were planned by Zionism. So this second failure is much more drastic, but was set up by the first failure. There's a failure of imagination on their part. And the last failure is the ideological failure. Once Israel is created, those exclusivist principles which were outlined by Herzl and followed by the early Zionists, and despite all the things that they spouted about socialism and kibbutz, and you know, it's all dead anyway, but at the time they really believed in what they were doing and what they were saying, they have a failure to this day, still because of lack of choice, talking about two states. For example, they would not and cannot imagine living with Palestinian Arabs in the same society, with the same rights. They are not able to give up ideologically or practically the colonial imperial state. I think I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much.